The title says it all. I'm going to break the rules from my previous videos. There's chapter markers in the description below so you can jump to whatever section you're interested in. And at the end, I give my thoughts about the whole process. So let's get started. Normally, I pick out my own still life subjects and I photograph them. So here's some examples from my previous videos. I would go out and buy the strawberries and all the different props. I'm always on the lookout for different colored poster boards. So I have different colored backgrounds for my paintings to choose from. And for this painting, I even dipped these strawberries in chocolate. But for this video, I decided to use an AI image. I used ChatGPT to generate this. You can download these reference photos by signing up for my free email newsletter. There's a link in the description. It's a bit controversial to use AI images for my own paintings, but I figured this is a video about breaking my own rules, so I went with it. So far, the advantage to using AI is that it's faster. I don't have to go out and buy a loaf of bread and look for a bottle I can put olive oil in. So it's really convenient to just sit on your couch and type in prompts into ChatGPT and get a result. I probably went through a dozen or two examples until I found one that I was happy with. And even then, I adjusted it a little bit. I had to change the proportion of it. I made it taller and I filled this part in on the top. I had to tell it not to center stuff so much. Like sometimes it puts stuff dead center. This is off to the side a little bit. But I do think that AI will eventually be accepted by painters, and there's already painters using it for reference material. On one hand, people rail against it because it's taking work away from illustrators and designers. But as a fine artist, I think you could use that to your advantage and use it as a tool like you would a camera. I don't know how much I'll make use of it in the future, but just for this video, I'm using AI. In my previous videos, I would just draw directly onto the board or canvas with a pencil or acrylic marker. In some cases, I just draw it by eye, such as my asparagus video where I don't use a grid. But in other cases, when I want a lot of accuracy, I might use a grid. And people often ask, why don't you just trace it or project it? So I'm going to break my own habits, and in this video, I'm going to trace it by using transfer paper. I have a video where I demonstrate how to use a video projector to enlarge a drawing or photo onto a larger canvas. The link is in the description below. This is the Saral transfer paper sampler. There's different colors of transfer paper. For this one, I'm going to use red. I think it'll stand out more. There are other types of transfer paper. This one is unique in that you can actually print on the paper using your inkjet printer. I used it in my painting of this avocado, and what I did was I scanned a drawing that was smaller and I scaled it up to the size of the panel. That way I can print it out on here and then just transfer it real quick onto the panel. Here's my reference photo that I'm going to trace. But this is just so I can transfer it to the panel. Another option is that you can coat the back with graphite. Then when you set it down and trace it, the graphite will transfer over to the board. To make this easier, I'll tape the top part of this so that I can lift it up and check to see how the drawing is being transferred. And then if I notice I missed a spot, I can place it down and it'll be in the exact same position. I've got this lined up, and then I'll just tape the top corners. I'll just flip it open and put the transfer paper underneath. So then I just put the print back down and I can begin tracing. I'm going to use this Uniball pen to trace it. And that's because it has a harder point than a pencil and the point won't break. Plus the darker lines will be easier to see where I already traced. I'll start with the loaf of bread and just start tracing the outline of it. This process is going to be a little bit tedious, but it's faster than drawing it by hand. This whole thing brings up the idea of, is it cheating to trace an image like this? And if you look at art history, artists like Gerhard Richter used slide projectors in order to trace their work. David Hockney wrote a book about how he thinks a lot of the masters used optical devices such as lenses and mirrors in order to project an image onto a canvas. It's a really interesting documentary and it brings up a lot of questions. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Another point is that some people think that using a grid is like tracing. The thing is, you can draw without a grid, but to do that, you sort of rely on other methods. The thing is, you can use your mind to make those comparisons too. Like you can look at the width of this bottle and pretty much see that it's pretty close to the distance from the bottom of the bottle to the line of the olive oil. I've got the left side mostly done, so now it's just a matter of lifting this up and moving the transfer paper over to the other side. So this is what I have so far. You can see the lines transferred pretty well. I've got the transfer paper on the right side, and I'll just flip this back down. So I'll just continue on with the tracing. I think I have most of this traced, but I need to check it out first before I remove this. I'll just carefully lift this up. I did miss a little edge here on the cloth. And what you can do is put it down and flip it back up to see if you missed something. So I'm just checking, is there anything important here that I missed? And I think I got most of it. That looks pretty good. I darkened up the exposure on the camera so you can see how well the line's transferred. This should work for a drawing. Now I'll move on to painting. I'm going to avoid all surface prep in this painting too, so that's another rule that I'm going to break. If you look at this painting, I added some texture using super heavy gesso. And I also used it in this painting of asparagus. You can see up close, there's some bristle marks. This is an example of a painting I did without using a grid or any tracing or anything like that. There are links to both of these videos in the description below in the related video section. I also sometimes tone the canvas with like a burnt sienna before I get started. I did that in my video of the cookie with the coffee mug. But for this painting, I figure if I were to do any of those things, it would obliterate this drawing, and it also just makes it faster. I'm not going to tone anything, I'm just going to go right into it with the paint. I typically recommend using a limited palette, especially when you're beginning. And that's because it forces you to mix all your colors rather than relying on pre-mixed colors in tubes like this. But as you gain experience and you do more production work, let's say you do a commission or you're just trying to get more painting done, it does help to have extra convenience colors on your palette. So for this video, I'm going to use at least 13 colors here for mixing. And I'm going to try to not use these colors on the top, which are my old reliables, such as quinacridone magenta, pyrola red, and phthalo blue. The lineup here is cadmium yellow primrose, cadmium orange, cadmium red light. Oop. You'll notice these are more of the traditional colors. There's cadmiums, and I also have all these earth colors. There's burnt umber, raw umber, burnt sienna. This is probably the earth color I use the most often. Yellow ochre. And you'll notice I have some 5-ounce tubes. It's actually cheaper to buy colors in larger tubes like this. If you compare what it costs per ounce, the 5-ounce tubes are cheaper. Dioxazine purple. And this is kind of a cheat. This is manganese blue hue. And the reason why I say it's cheating is because there is phthalo blue in there. But I don't know if I'm going to use this. There's not too many cool colors in here. I usually just use blues to like tone things down and stuff like that. And this is what I call palette gray. This is leftover paint from previous paintings. I have an entire video about how I use large syringes like this to store leftover paint. It does work out better than using those empty metal tubes. And I have an entire video about why I don't use black or grays in my paintings. So in this video, I have to use black and gray. And there's nothing wrong with using black. It's just most times you see something that looks like black in a painting, it's actually a color. But if you know what to look for, you can just start with black and adjust it. And I'm going to try to use this titanium buff. And that might be helpful because this painting has like a warm tint to it, and I think this might help. And I also have a large tube of titanium white. So I'll squeeze these out on my palette and I'll get started with painting. In my previous videos, I would spend a lot of time pre-mixing colors, and that's so that I have more time for blending. I don't have to stop what I'm doing and mix more colors. But this time around, I'll do it differently, and I'll mix colors only as I need them. I'm going to start with this silver pitcher, and I'll just start mixing some neutral colors. In a way, all these colors are kind of like pre-mixed colors. There's a starting point. So if I want gray, I could just pick up some of this palette gray. I'm going to mix this color here. So I think a little bit of this burnt sienna. I think that needs to go darker. I'll actually use some black. And it's warmer than that. It's like a brownish color. All right, so maybe a little yellow ochre. It'll be interesting to see if it's easier to mix colors as you need them rather than mixing them ahead of time. So that's about right. And so that was like this section right here. So I'll just fill that in. I think it gets a little bit more bluish towards this area. So I'll try some of this manganese blue. The color gets warmer as it moves more towards the right, so I added more yellow ochre and a little bit of burnt sienna. Well, I have this color on my brush. It makes sense to fill in all the areas on the picture that have that color. So I'll use some more of this grayish color, and I'm getting this section here. I think that's pretty close to this. So I think that'll work for this area. Maybe I can go back in and I'll use some of the buff titanium to lighten it up. I'll add more white and some more of the blue, because it looks like that gray gets more cool as it gets towards the highlight. Like I said, I'm trying not to use my ultramarine and my phthalo blue, but in a way, this kind of is like phthalo blue. Like I said, I'm trying to use new colors, so that's why I'm using the manganese. So that's a little bit lighter, maybe a little bit cooler. I'm using a third brush for the pure highlight. This is buff titanium, and I'll add some regular titanium white in there. I don't want to use pure white because it just looks too unnatural. It might be a little too warm. I can always change it if I want to. So these are the brightest highlights on the picture. I'll just put them in. I could take the brush that has that gray on there and mix in some of that highlight color. That way I can sort of blend that in there so it doesn't have such a hard edge. And I'll do the same up here. I think this section here is mostly this dark color with a little bit of the cooler gray and some warm sections in there. So I'll just put some of this in here. It gets a little bit warmer, like right about here. And I'll work back into the darker color just to complete this section. I think the next logical section would be to complete this highlight right here. So I'll start with the buff titanium, add a little bit of the yellow ochre, maybe a touch of the burnt sienna. And it's too light, so I could probably just dip into some of these colors. That's closer, I think just a touch of the burnt sienna. And I'm seeing a similar color down here, so I'll just throw that in there real quick. I'm just using the brush with the darker color in here to complete some of these sections that I missed. I'll work on this color next. I could see it up here too. So it's kind of like the highlight color, but it's warmer. So I'll just do some buff titanium, some burnt sienna, and yellow ochre. Maybe a little bit of black. It has to go warmer. Maybe I'll use a little bit of cadmium orange. It's actually not too bad. When you paint something reflective like this, it really does look kind of weird when you first start filling it in, but as you put in more and more of the shapes, it starts to create the illusion that it's shiny. You sort of have to go against what your mind actually thinks that color is and just go with what's in the photograph or what you see in reality. Now that I have some of these colors mixed up, I can just dip into them and probably fill in the rest of this without really having to mix too many new colors. So for instance, this is a little bit darker here, so I could just go into this section, pick up that darker brown color, and it's not too bad for that area. What I noticed so far is it does feel like I have more room on my palette. If you look at this, I have like 3/4 of the palette available, and these are pretty much all the colors I need for this silver picture. I do think it does get a little bit darker in some sections, like right here. Right now I'm getting rid of all these little white spots between the different patches of colors. I think it'll help make it look more complete. And if I wipe my brush off, I don't really contaminate the new areas too much. I'm going to complete the base, the handle, and then the rest of the top part of it. Like I said, I have most of the colors mixed up, so it's just a matter of painting them in there. Now that I have most of the colors filled in, I'll use a soft brush to blend some of it. I'm not going to blend the entire painting, but I feel like the focal point should be the most rendered. So I'll just do some circular motions and then wipe the paint off my brush. I can feel the paint is getting a little bit tacky, but that's actually good because then it makes it easier to blend. If it's too wet, it just sort of slides around the panel. I usually tell beginners to mix their own grays instead of reaching straight for black or pre-mixed gray. That's because shadows in neutral areas aren't really neutral. They're full of subtle color. When you rely too much on black, your painting can end up looking flat or lifeless. To show what I mean, here's a clip of the finished silver picture. On the left, I've converted it to grayscale so you can see how much color is actually present in the version on the right. If you look at the colors in my palette, they really don't look like they're gray in isolation. But when your eye is trained for color mixing, you start to recognize these subtle variations. Once you develop that skill, you can use premixed colors more intentionally. That's what I did in this painting. The palette gray that I used, which is the leftover paint from previous paintings, that's not neutral either. In this case, it had a bluish tint that worked really well to represent the color of the metal. So instead of avoiding black or gray completely, the real goal is to train your eye to see neutral colors more accurately. Once you develop that skill, you can use premixed blacks and grays strategically. There are two basic ways to make a painting. The first one is referred to as the indirect method, which is what I typically use, where you build up a painting in layers. So I might tone the canvas, do a sketch, block in the basic shapes, and keep refining it as I go. The direct method is more like the Alla prima method, where you just do one layer. And that's what I'm trying to do in this painting, because it's the opposite of what I normally do. So for example, I painted most of this silver picture before I go on to complete another section. I just have to refine the edge here, and I might put a little bit more detail on here. But I'll probably move on to doing a little bit of the background and then the bottle of olive oil. And I'll just expand it outwards. The advantage of it is it seems like psychologically you get something finished and it's satisfying. Whereas with the indirect method, it can take a while before something starts to look refined, and it can be discouraging. The downside of this though is I probably should have toned the canvas, but that's one thing I was trying to do differently, because it's harder to judge colors on such a stark white board like this. The other challenge too is making the colors look unified throughout the whole painting, because you're working on it section at a time. But if you know how to mix colors, that shouldn't be too much of a challenge. The other thing too about adding in some of this background color is I can soften some of these edges so that the whole thing's not completely sharp. I think within this painting, the most developed and rendered objects should be the picture, the olive oil, and the bread. But the background, I could leave it more brushy, and I could put in less detail on the cloth and the table. So that's the plan, is I'll complete this picture and then expand the painting outwards. This gray is leftover paint from previous paintings. I just scrape up the paint on my palette and mix it up, and it creates this grayish color. So it's satisfying to recycle this paint into a new painting. Artist grade paints are pretty expensive, so it doesn't make sense to throw it out in the garbage. One thing that I'm noticing is that adding this darker color in makes this picture make more sense. It doesn't look so dark anymore. And that's because the white of the panel was throwing it off. It's so bright, it makes these colors look darker than what they actually are. But once I put these colors in, it looks more normal. So one thing I'm thinking of is softening some of these edges now that I have the background painted in. And that's just so the sharpest areas will stand out more, and then some of these other areas will sort of recede into the background a little bit more. In other words, I don't want every part of this picture to be totally focused. These are golden open acrylics, so they dry slower, and that allows me to do this. I made an entire video where I review these paints. There's a link to it in the description below. So I'll do the same thing on this side, or at least part of the side, and then maybe let some of that go into focus. Perhaps the back side of the top part could be a little bit softer. I think that's good for now. Maybe I'll put in some of this table color and then move over to the left. So far, I only have this much of the palette consumed with paint, so this does seem to be a little bit more efficient use of the palette. For this background color, I'll probably just use burnt sienna, some of the cadmium orange, and black. It's a little bit too reddish, so I'll put in some more of the yellow ochre. Maybe a little bit of the cadmium yellow, just because I think it might be a little bit more opaque, and some more of the black. It's actually not too bad, so let's just try it out. It does look a little bit darker than the print. That might be better. I think it might be a little too reddish. I'll add more yellow. This edge of the table, I definitely want to soften this. It's kind of like how a photograph has depth of field where stuff in the background is blurry, and that just helps direct your eye to the things that are sharp. So I think that looks better. I mixed up a neutral color for the cloth, and I'll just put that in real quick. I started with the buff titanium and added some of the earth colors to it. This paint was for the picture, but now I can dip into that to create shadow colors for this cloth. I might have to add a little bit of like purple and black to it. Maybe a little red. I've got this section mostly done. Now I'll start working on the bottle of olive oil. I'll start with the cadmium yellow primrose, cadmium orange, and it needs a darker color, so maybe a touch of this dioxazine purple. So that's not too bad for that color. Try it out. Yeah, I think it's about right. There's a lighter section in here. I just added more yellow to it. This darker section defines the curve of the bottle, so it's important to get that in there accurately. I'm going to take a break, and the thing is I can Store this plastic palette in my MASTERSON palette and keep it wet. It helps if I spritz the colors with a little bit of water. That way when I put the lid on it, it'll remain humid inside. I actually let these paints sit overnight, so if I open this up, we can see if they're still wet. So all of these paint piles are definitely wet, and I would imagine, yes, even these little puddles of paint are still wet. So if you don't like the glass palette that I normally have in here, you could use one of these plastic ones. And the cool thing about keeping these wet is it's so much easier to clean. At the end, maybe I'll demonstrate how I can clean this off really quick. The one thing I like about this palette is it has this section here for your piles of paint, but it doesn't have all those dividers in there, which can make it really difficult to clean. If you had like a dozen different wells at the bottom of this, it's hard to get in there with a paper towel and clean all that out. And acrylics are thick enough that they really don't merge into each other too much. Open acrylics are a little bit softer, and even though this was stored on an incline, I have like a drafting table, it doesn't really flow downwards too much. So this is a pretty good solution. I'll continue on and paint this bottle, and I think I'll start by painting the background color, which actually continues through where you can see through the glass. So this is the background color. It's the palette gray and the cadmium orange. I can easily mix up more of this, but that's what's nice about this gray is I have enough of it where I can easily go back to this color if I want to. That's the advantage of using grays that are pre-mixed. In this case, this gray is from my leftover colors, but you can also buy Payne's gray or other pre-mixed grays. The point is that you'll have a standard gray that you can use as a reliable starting point if you want to go back into an area and rework it. Now that the outside is done, I figure I'll do this inside part. It's pretty much the same color as the background. So I'll paint that in, and I can go in and make some lighter sections that represent the reflections on the glass. It pays to think ahead like that so you don't wash your brush out as much and the painting flows a little bit easier. I actually think this might be slightly darker than the background, so I could add some black in there or maybe some brown and blue. Now that I have that color blocked in, I mixed up a slightly lighter color for the highlight section. We need to go a little bit lighter, but I think it works for this area down here. And the section on the top here is even more orange. So I'll take some of this orange, mix it in with the buff titanium, and then into this grayish color. And I'd say that's about right. So if you look, there's the background color, a highlight, a darker version of the background color, a highlight, and like a dark outline. So that's a bunch of stripes I have to put in here. And you have to keep that straight in your mind as you're painting it so you don't mix them up. But I think once I get these stripes in here, this will look pretty transparent. I'll have to put the highlight in there too. If you're interested in learning how to paint transparent effects, I have a demo where I demonstrate how to paint glass objects. The link is in the related video section in the description below. Some of that color is in the top, so I'll put that in there while I have it on my brush. I did have to mix up the color of the cork, but that was pretty easy. And I already had the color of the olive oil mixed up. It was just a matter of filling it in. I've completed this much of the painting so far, and this is how much of the palette that I've used up. A benefit that I recognize is that I could just scrape this up and mix it all together. And I can do that because I'm only mixing colors as I need them. I'm finished with the bottle, so I don't need these colors anymore. If I mix it together, I can just have like a warmish color that I can use as like a starting point for other areas of the painting. This leftover color might work for some of the table color, or maybe if I add some white to it, I could use it on the tablecloth. If I need to, I could just wipe some of this clean, and that way I can mix up lighter colors without contaminating them. These are just cotton rounds that people use for makeup. You can also just use a paper towel. So now I have all this extra working area. I've said this in other videos, but sometimes it helps to do a reset, especially on your palette. That way you feel a little bit more organized and you have a lot of room to work in. This bread has like a nice crusty look to it, and I think I can create that by just varying the shades of this brown. So for example, I can make it just slightly lighter and put in some brush strokes, and don't blend them, just sort of leave it. The loaf of bread is simpler because it's just a few shades of brown. The difficulty of it is painting the subtle texture of the crust, and that's because it mostly consists of abstract shapes, and it can be difficult to tell where each shape belongs. It doesn't have to be totally accurate, but the light and shadow patterns have to be convincing. The bread is mostly done, and I blocked in the tablecloth. I think I'll do the rest of the table and then the background. I think this should get easier as I go because I did all the detailed parts first, and now this is mostly just flat areas of color. This is the leftover paint that I had that I scraped up from the palette, and I'm thinking I could probably use this for the table color. In most of my recent still life demos, I took the time to create smooth gradients and blends. I have multiple videos about how to blend acrylics like oils, but since this video is about reversing my approach to painting, I thought I would allow the brushstrokes to show in the background. This is the same palette gray and cadmium orange mixture that I used at the beginning. The gray is biased more towards blue, and I like how the orange creates a little bit of variety. The colors are similar in value, so the variation is more subtle. This part of the painting was fun because it was mostly complete, and painting in the background wasn't too mentally taxing. I put on some music and just filled it in. I went back into some areas and added some finishing touches. The cloth needed a little bit more detail, for instance, but for the most part, this painting is complete. Doing the opposite of what you normally do is based on a mental model called inversion. And that's where you just reverse what you normally do and see what the results are. So that's what I did in this video, and it did have an impact on my thoughts about painting. So my thought about AI and art is that while it does impact people's jobs, especially commercial work, you can, as an artist, use it as a tool to make more artwork. The ways that it could make my process more efficient is that I wouldn't have to set up a still life or go hunt down landscapes. This isn't the first time that painters had to deal with this. When photography was first invented, it seemed like it killed painting because you could get a portrait within like 1/100th of a second. And then when color photography came out, it was even a bigger blow to artists. But if you looked at how painters responded, they actually got more creative. You look at Impressionism, Cubism, Abstract Expressionism, those all came out of doing things that you can't do with a camera. So I'm looking at it in the same perspective as how can we use this to our advantage? So I might be using AI a little bit more in the future. I'll see how that goes. So with the topic of tracing, that's kind of another controversial thing too, where some people think that it's cheating if you trace, but on the other hand, professional artists who have their paintings in museums, they trace slides, they have a slide projector and they trace it. So will I use this tracing method in the future? Probably not. I enjoy the drawing process. I enjoy seeing how shapes interlock with each other. And there's something in my mind that sort of finds that satisfying, being able to sketch what you see. So I might do something where maybe I do small sketches and then I enlarge it and transfer it onto a larger canvas or panel. That would help me save some time. Surface prep, I think I might keep the toning because, as I mentioned in the video, it does help you judge colors better rather than painting on stark white. As far as the super heavy gesso and creating brush marks, I think I could just paint thicker with the paint if I want thicker brush marks. So I might not do as much texturizing, but I will probably tone it. That only takes a minute or two to tone it with like burnt sienna or something like that. I think I will be adding more colors to my palette in the future. It's fun having more colors and they have different qualities that I can take advantage of. For one, some might be more opaque like the cadmiums, and having a set of earth colors and neutral colors does make it a little bit faster. I can use that as a starting point and then adjust them. It was kind of surprising how useful I found buff titanium, and that's because I normally have to take white and then dull it down somehow. I either make it into like a beige or like a gray color, but with the buff titanium, it's kind of like that straight from the tube. So I'll definitely be using that and some of these earth colors. I did enjoy mixing colors as I go rather than pre-mixing them. It seems to be a little bit more convenient, and it seems to prevent the palette from getting clogged up with a bunch of different mixtures. But I do think you kind of have to use it with the direct painting method where maybe you work on one section at a time. And that leads me to the part about direct painting versus indirect painting. I normally build paintings up in layers, but I took the direct route in this demonstration. And it seems to be easier. That's because within the first like 20 or 30 minutes, you can see a result. You have something that looks like it's done. And that sort of gives you confidence with the rest of the painting. Now, if you compare that to working in layers, that seems to be a little bit more challenging mentally because it's not until the very end that it comes together. And that's the other cool thing about this process is that you can front load it with the difficult work. In other words, I can work on all the focal points first to have all the detail. And then as the painting progresses, it feels like it gets easier. So once I had these 3 objects done, the cloth, the table, and the background, those were easy. And it got more enjoyable as I progressed throughout the painting. Whereas when I work indirectly, it doesn't seem to come together until that last minute. It just seems to get more and more difficult. You're getting down to finer and finer details, and you have to make it work. Whereas this starts to work right from the beginning. So I think I'll be painting like this more often. That also led to the idea of allowing the brushstrokes to show rather than blending it out. If you don't smooth everything out, it gives it more variety, and the painting is actually easier to complete because you're not spending all this time trying to smooth everything out. You can see that in the background, there's some orange showing through, and the gray is a little bit more blue. And even the tablecloth isn't highly rendered, and neither is the table. I put all the attention into the main focal points. So I think in future paintings, I might exaggerate this even more, or maybe have more abstract brushstrokes in the background. We'll see how that goes. All the advice about not using black or premixed grays, the whole point of that is to learn how to see colors how they actually are. When you're forced to mix grays and blacks and other neutral colors from primary colors, it forces you to see the color as it is. But once you learn how to mix colors, you can have fun and just start with the black or the brown and adjust it as needed. It does help you to paint a little bit faster because you're not starting from scratch every time you're mixing brown or black. I hope you found that useful. I think I'll be using some of these techniques in the future. Try them out, see what you think, leave a comment below. If you have any ideas of what I should try in the future, leave them in the comments. Maybe I'll try it in the next video. Thanks for watching.